Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. And today I am with Goleta City Councilman Stuart Kasdin, one of my favorite elected officials, if for no other reason other than he's funny and clever and really makes council meetings worth watching because he's so witty and humorous, but also a big policy guy as well. And today we're going to talk about housing, and this whole Santa Barbara County housing element and how it affects Goleta, the Eastern Goleta Valley. Stuart Kasdin, my pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. And it's such a big issue, so I'm glad we have the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, Stuart, let's just go dive right in. We know the background here. We know that we have these state mandated numbers for housing. We know that Santa Barbara County is looking to find land to zone for this kind of housing. And I think it's something like 5,600 units that the county has to find land for. And here on the South Coast is about 4,500. And they came out with their plan, and wow, ag land proposed to be rezoned. And we're talking about on the edges of Goleta, the city of Goleta. And I want to just throw it out there to you, Stuart. I know that you have been vocal about this at public meetings. Where do you stand? What do you think of the housing element and their proposed sites and how they affect the city of Goleta?
So, if I think the first point to make is that our concern for me, and I think the rest of the council, is not about whether we need housing, whether this is a question of is there enough housing or advocating against housing. We're for it. And so, I recognize the problem. I remember in when I was campaigning in 2016, I got to a house. It was a woman who right around Pacific Oaks. And when I was, just chatting, she started crying and talking about how her life she's like a slave, she said, working just to pay for the housing. And she was in tears, and you don't forget that. So I accept that and recognize that concern, and I'm supportive of trying to do something about it. Our problem is with how they're doing it. And right now, the approach that they're doing is essentially to open the bidding or open the door and say, who wants to rezone their property? And whoever advocates and seeks to change their zoning, that, you win. And that is inconsistent with the county's principles. That is inconsistent with what they have stood for all of these years. So my primary concern is they're not living up to their own values. They previously you could start in 2009, where the city of Goleta actually proposed to the organization LAFCO, which is the organization, the county level organization that administers border changes. And the city wanted to, in essence, extend its authority over adjacent areas, including the areas the county is now proposing to rezone. We were literally, we were rejected at that time. I wasn't on council, but the reason that the county rejected the city's proposal is because they were afraid the city would turn it into housing.
Right.
And they advocated at the time, they said, we don't believe in sprawl. We don't believe you should be expanding your borders in order to add more housing. What you should be doing is infill. You should be doing is, looking at your existing capacity if you need to add housing. You can go more recent than that. In 2015, the Eastern Goleta Valley Community Plan, also the same sort of advocacy, the same sort of emphasis that they had as far as protecting the agricultural areas and the open spaces. And as recently as I saw, I believe in News Talk, just within the past month or two, the county turned down the city of Lompoc's proposed expansion to convert ag lands to housing, saying that that's consistent with the county's values. So the concern that I have is not just inherently the location, as much as it is that this is not their own principles, their own goals, and they're in the interests of sort of being safe, in the interests of satisfying the state. They've abandoned all the things that I think they inherently stand for. And I understand the state is a great concern, and what will they do and things like that. But I don't think it means you just abandon what you stand for.
Hmm.
I can,
Yeah. So
continue my soliloquy, but
no, I think you make a lot of sense. I interviewed Lisa Plowman, the planning and development director for the county, and I paraphrased, summarized kind of your sentiment there when I talked to her. I said, what would you say to the city of Goleta and those individuals who say, hey, Goleta wanted these properties in their sphere of influence, and LAFCO said no, because we don't want it to be housing. And here now the county is asking for these areas to be rezoned for housing. And I put that question to her, and her answer was, I would say to them that times have changed, that our housing crisis is much more extreme and dramatic than it was when the city of Goleta went before LAFCO, that there are no easy solutions, that everybody has to relook at how they plan for housing because of this crisis. So I want to throw that back at you. This idea that, hey, Stuart, in 2009, it wasn't as bad as it is in 2023, so we're going to have to rethink what LAFCO said. What do you respond? How do you respond to that sentiment?
When they had their hearing most recently, we asked that one of the principles that they should adhere to is to say that ag lands, converting, rezoning ag lands to residential, should be a last case. That first, before they do that, they should look at their existing capacity. What they listed, I believe it was 256 areas that were commercial or mixed use of some sort or another that you potentially could add. If it's a commercial site, add another layer or do something and enhance that capacity for residential units. Of those 356 units, they have proposed, and only most recently, only after their first hearing, only one of those did they propose that they were going to try and rezone or try and enhance the expected residential units. And that was the one at the Magnolia where they expected they would generate 100 units. So out of the 200, it's a 256 or 356, 256, I think. Out of the 256, they're thinking they'll get 100 units. Instead, what it seems like to me is they went for this, in essence, the low-hanging fruit. The others really, it's uncertain. You don't have this statement of certainty from a developer. Yes, we will go ahead with it. But I don't think whether because the land is expensive, as in the case of some of the Hope Ranch and others, whether because it's expensive or because there's a lack of expressed intent by developers, you don't take it off the table.
Yeah.
Our jobs as cities and counties is to choose where it makes the most sense for us. Where do we think it makes sense? Looking at traffic, looking at available services, looking at infrastructure. Where does new development really help us? Where does it make our county better? And it's not just that you sort of say, ag lands, the most egregious sites. You tell us if you're interested, the door is open. It doesn't make sense from a planning perspective. I mean, you don't need to have a planning department if you're going to let whoever comes in say, I'm going to do it. Why have a planning department if you're not going to plan? If you're not going to look at the impacts of your proposed sites if you're not going to pay any attention to that.
Yeah.
So my response to that is yes, I agree that it isn't 2009 now. It isn't even 2015 when they had their community plan, the Eastern Goleta Valley Community Plan. But it still doesn't mean that the only place you can satisfy those housing concerns is going to be on ag lands, class 1 ag lands, or the golf course. And the rationale or the concern with the ag lands is different than the golf courses. I can talk about that, but it isn't the same issue.
Right.
But they should be going for, in essence, either A, they should be going for the sort of the build out capacity infill, going for those commercial areas and other areas, and see about enhancing the density, enhancing the how many units you can put there, or some sort of selective urbanization. LA, for instance, after years and years of just relying on sprawl, right? The LA and Orange County, the model was sprawl. Just keep going further and further out, adding and extending your freeways. And more recently, what they've done, go to downtown and other places, they're putting in tall buildings. That's they recognize that the other model doesn't work so well. Doesn't work well from a climate perspective, climate change. It doesn't work well from an infrastructure perspective. And we should be learning from those experiences. I'm not going to say, when you're adding housing, nobody's going to be excited to say, let's put more density or something in our area or our neighborhood. Nobody's going to say, wonderful, put it in my neighborhood. But ultimately, we have to say, what is it that we think is important? Do we want to preserve agricultural and open spaces? If so, then what can we do to get to that point? And I don't think the county has really looked at that. They just went as the simplest way, the easiest way, the low-hanging fruit was proposed to rezone ag.
Yeah, and I was sort of struck when I was doing my reporting, and you alluded to it as well, is everybody who made the list, those property owners were open to building housing or selling to a developer who would build housing. And to me, that feels as though the developers and the property owners are deciding and running the show. Right. And the county came back to me and they said, well, we don't want a political fight. So if we put a whole bunch of properties on there where the owners do not want to have it rezoned, then that's going to be trouble for us in front of the Board of Supervisors, and that's going to delay everything more and more. That's what Lisa Plowman told me. So we'd rather have the buy-in at the front end than down the road. And I think that goes back to your point of, well, of course, you're going to have a skewed distribution of where this housing is going to go, because no one in Hope Ranch is going to be like, rezone this land, or no one in Montecito is going to be like, rezone this land. And so, I mean, going to the property owners and getting their consent first to rezone their land feels, I don't know if that's how they do it everywhere, but it feels inherently problematic.
Yeah, I mean, so it does feel problematic. In their defense, it shows for the state, yes, this is a serious proposal. Yes, you're going to get housing. And that's the rationale I think that they have for doing it that way, is that then it's less speculative than if it's a property where you don't know what will happen or where it will go. Will they sell it to another developer? But I think the idea that you have to get concurrence otherwise ahead of time, and not even evaluate, not even offer some sort of incentives. It might be that there's a property that really makes sense, that is really for a little selective urban island or something like that. We could, it would really make a lot of sense. Well, then you talk to the landowner, you figure out what it would do to get to that outcome. Is it more density? Is it parking requirements changed? Is it setbacks? I mean, there's ways that the city or the county rather can cultivate the outcome that they want. And they don't have to be completely passive and just let, you know, the ag folks choose. You know, let's say if it wasn't housing and we were talking about putting in an oil refinery or, you know, and are we just going to say, well, we'll just leave it to the landowners to do it? They found a nice lot next to the high school or something. Yeah, so there's a reason you have zoning to figure out what makes sense, what works given your road system, given where there's existing traffic, given you know, fire breaks. You know, there's a whole lot of rationales why one area makes sense and another area doesn't, and you should be trying to express where you want the county to go, what you want it to look like through your zoning decisions. Yeah. And I can see they want to avoid having the state come down on them, but you don't have to sort of go for the simplest, the capitulate ahead of time before, you know, it's sort of, I remember seeing a cartoon. It was something like, fearing the iceberg ahead, the captain decided to sink the Titanic just to be safe, or something like that.
Yeah. You know, Stuart, one of the reasons you ran for council was because of all those traffic signals and traffic on Hollister leading up to Costco and the new shopping center out there. And I think people who aren't in Goleta or who have sort of a double standard for Santa Barbara versus Goleta, they like to say, well, oh, Goleta's like where the housing should go and all of these things. Well, Goleta is where the housing has been built. I mean, I think you remember a time when you didn't have to spend 15 minutes, you know, trying to cross through that intersection because of all those extra traffic lights and all of that traffic because of the housing that the formerly conservative council approved a long time ago and then got built later. And there's no doubt we need more housing. It's not a question of whether we need more housing. It's we need to stop having this double standard of let's urbanize Goleta, because those families and individuals will deal with it better than if we urbanize other areas of the county. Like, we need to get over that. But I mentioned that, Stuart, because I want to talk about Glen Annie Golf Club, because there's a proposal to rezone that land for 1,500 units. Anybody who spends any time around Stork and Hollister knows that's a horrible proposal. What's your take on housing there?
It's crazy. I mean, it's so, to put it in perspective, 1,500 units. Number one, that's roughly the amount of units they have proposed for the whole North County. So when they divided up how much for North County and how much for South County, yeah, North County got about 1,500 units. That's what they're proposing, the same amount just in the Glen Annie Golf Course. Right. 1,500 units is about 15% or so of Goleta's total housing units right now. We have about 11,000 or so housing units in the entire city. So right at that little road, they would put in 1,500 units. So the problems with it, first, let's just say, what if there were a disaster? That's like having all of Old Town behind one small road, that the entire Old Town would have to leave through this one small area. It's adding a whole district connected by a small road. The road where it is right now, it's right next to the high school. You know, hopefully nobody has to leave in the morning from that 1,500 units right around people are going to high school. I assume they'll all be working from home. You know, so it's already in other words, it's already incredibly congested with the high school there. And that road, you know, that intersection has already been identified by SBCAG and others as a problematic intersection, or the off-ramp rather, on the 101, where it backs up. You can see it back up all the way practically to the next Los Carneros, to the next intersection. It's really dangerous, where you see this long line of cars waiting to get off. It would be an incredible fire risk because this is our buffer. This is where the fire chief, for instance, said we want this as a staging area if we need to have it. It's also, how would we evacuate from that area? If there's a disaster of 1,500 people or 1,500 housing units coming down that little road, and the impacts, Cathedral Oaks right now is one lane.
Yeah.
You couldn't have it one lane. They would have to add an entire lane. Is that possible to start adding a whole lane, extra lanes each way? Because you'd have to, with that volume, it would have to be more like Hollister. So, and lastly, this goes back to principles again. You have the urban boundary and the rural boundary. This is building on the other side of that boundary, of that threshold. And it's not something that the county has ever suggested is a good idea or appropriate. And so it like I said, it really is, our concern is not that we're looking to maintain golf in Goleta. The council regularly goes golfing, and we want a choice in our golfing locations. It's that it just, from a impact perspective, it doesn't make sense. It just seems utterly arbitrary. Like, oh, here's a big area. They've said they have an interest in developing it. Great, perfect, and paying zero attention to whether it makes sense.
Yeah.
Now I'll add this. The county specifically said that they added a buffer when they put together their draft element for the supervisors. They included a buffer.
Oh, extra units.
Extra. Yeah, on top of the 15%. So the state has your target, and then they want you to include 15% extra. The planning staff added an additional 4,000 units just to be safe. So they can easily just drop Glen Ann. And I would hope and expect that they do that, because it's just it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So the buffer, the extra 15% is included in this total number that they've been circulating.
Yeah. They have, as I understand, and I might be mistaken, but as I understand, they have a number that is, they have provided 15% for the state, and then an extra buffer with the expectation that the Board of Supervisors will be able to make some choices.
Yeah.
And this seems like this is not, it doesn't make any sense. It's not a question of values or anything like that. It's just amateurish, frankly.
Yeah. And so on the other end of Goleta is the San Marcos growers sites. And there's been a letter into the public record from the manager of San Marcos growers opposing this. Can you talk about what the concerns are there when it comes to that ag land? Because there are some who say, oh, I get how Glen Annie's a bad idea, but the San Marcos growers is right there on this Hollister corridor, so that makes sense. Can you talk about what the concern is with that property, those properties?
Well, so like I said, you have the ag properties, the South Patterson ag block, that sort of bunch of properties, and the concerns are really inherently different than Glen Annie, because, like you say, they are within the city, or not within the city, but they're in the urban area, so to speak, and it's primarily based. I mean, in their case, they said, look at all the people who are going to lose their jobs. And, we have a thriving business, and you're potentially we've been here for 50 years and you're going to tear it apart. I would add the irony, of course, that irony being that the state made a point, or excuse me, the county made a point of saying, where is there going to be acceptance? Where would it be not political, and so forth and so on? And we have a letter from them saying, don't do this.
Right.
But I think primarily the biggest concern with those ag properties is that they didn't exhaust alternatives before they proposed it. They
Mhm.
went right in for the ag properties, and they didn't consider whether you can have infill to satisfy it. That 355 sites that they didn't consider, or they didn't spend any time on, maybe some of those, uh, Upper State Street, Turnpike, some of those other locations could benefit from having greater housing, residential housing there. And we need to look at all of those, even if you don't have an offer in hand, so to speak, from the owner of the property. It might still really make sense if you look at it on a countywide basis.
Yeah.
And so our argument was don't go to ag first.
Right.
Exhaust all these other areas and then look at the ag option if you need to. And, I would say this, that there, some of the Board of Supervisors have a history of trying to protect ag lands and green belts and things like that. Now I know that Joan Hartman was pre being on the Board of Supervisors was something, I forgot the name of it but it was a group that advocated and successfully to protect the green belt around Buellton. And she also helped and supported when Goleta did something similar. We have something G2012 that protects the ag, so ag lands within the city of Goleta. In order to rezone them, it requires a vote of the people. And they have something similar in Buellton. And so there's, that reflects their interests, that to go after the ag properties after you've gone after all these other ones.
Right. Laura Capps, second district supervisor. I get the sense that she's pushing for properties other than ag properties in her district. Do you have any sense of hope from what you've heard since all this attention? She's new that maybe there's going to be some defense of these ag lands from her office.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, I can't predict what the Board of Supervisors will do. Obviously there has to be additional support from members beyond Joan and Laura.
Right.
And that's why I'm hopeful that they will say it's important for us to preserve these properties. Let me give you another reason why I think it's important, that maybe hopefully would resonate at least with some. And I'm thinking of global warming. That has been an expressed concern from the Board of Supervisors. And to go, let's say, with Glen Annie Golf Course, it's they would have to drive for everything, right? Everywhere there's zero services, there's not adequate water, there's no infrastructure, but to get anywhere, they're going to have to drive.
Yeah.
So that's bad from that vehicle miles traveled. You want to encourage new residents to be in an urbanish area where people could walk or bike or something like that to get to the services they want.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make sense from an urban perspective, but ag, or, from a climate change perspective rather. But ag also, I mean, you have that whole premise of some sort of carbon sink, something like that. There's a benefit to having agricultural lands, which should encourage those concerned about climate change to focus and seek more little urbanized areas to emphasize that sort of planning principle as opposed to the sprawl.
Let me ask you another question here, about public outreach. The county, of course, did a meeting in North County, and then they did a meeting in South County. And that was sort of the extent of their public outreach. And I happened to write about one of those meetings. I happened to read one of their press releases that they put out. And then, I started writing stories. But a lot of people were stunned when they saw the Glen Annie, the San Marcos growers, the total number of units. And I know you spoke at the South Coast one. So did a few other Goleta council members, probably too many for one meeting. um, but there was a lot of outrage at that meeting. What do you think of the county's public outreach? And I mean, I guess I'm asking you to beat up on them a little bit here. I talked to Lisa Plowman about this, and they said, "Oh, we're down 30% in staff. It's hard to retain anyone. This process is so rigorous. The state has all of these challenges. You know, they want these to be real sites. Then there's 100 other entities that are not going to make their deadline." Is that any excuse for how they rolled this out, Stuart?
No. I mean, number one, there's been a lot of time that they've had to do this. And I think the impression I get is that they started from the beginning. The philosophy they had was they had to get concurrence on everything. And whatever they were going to do, they had to get developers to agree. And all of that outreach took a lot of time. And they also seemingly roped off a few areas, the wealthier areas, to say we're not even going to ask in a lot of those, Hope Ranch, for instance. Yeah. And I think, you know, I'm sympathetic if they have personnel problems, but they could have talked to us, for instance. They could have talked to others. They could have asked for, did they ask to hire some, you know, more people? Did they, you know, if there's a problem, when you have 8 years, and I know I'm exaggerating, they didn't really have 8 years because they didn't know what their target was going to be, but it's not like this is a complete surprise. Yeah. And releasing this information right before the Christmas break and within months of when it's going to be due and they're going to be submitting it, you know, it certainly didn't give them time or us time to do much to adjust it. It seemed like they were offering a fait accompli. The other thing that is, I'm not sure about, and I would need clarification, is on their website. Apparently it indicates that they were, or they are going to do an EIR. So in other words, they were going to evaluate, do a environmental review and of the impacts for this proposed housing element submission, that they were going to analyze what it means. And what we've heard, I guess, I don't know if it's anecdotally or whatnot, is that they were thinking of doing away with that and not evaluating that until it came time to actually do the zoning.
Yeah.
And obviously the zoning emerges as a consequence of the decision of whatever they have in this proposed plan. So I wasn't sure, I didn't understand if they really are not going to evaluate the impacts, like Glen Annie, we're just not even going to look at it, we'll just send it up and not evaluate what the consequences or the impacts of these things are, not to look at the alternatives and see what alternatives are available. So I guess I don't know what their plan is, but it doesn't seem wise to just choose not to analyze. I mean, that's what CEQA's for. The whole point of having CEQA is to, and you know, understand, give the public an opportunity to weigh in on different alternatives, to weigh in on different approaches. Maybe the public does want to have this approach and that sprawl is more popular than I expected. Okay, but let's offer it up. Let's analyze what it means, understand the trade-offs, and then, you know, go forward from that. That seems like good government to me.
There's a letter that the Goleta City Council has wants to send to the county, and I believe this is going to go to a board this week, and that board's going to vote to send it to the county. And I know a lot of that we talked about already, but what is the essence of this letter? What is the message you want the county to take away from this letter that is signed by everyone on the Goleta Council?
So right now the county has a comment period. They're open to comments until March 1st. And so this is a letter that is going to be our city comment on the housing element. So the county is going to receive comments up until then and then digest them after that. Yeah, we know what happens after digestion. But this is our comment letter. And so we have a meeting on Monday. It's a special meeting on Monday to discuss the letter and then hopefully send it off after that.
Yeah. And so if you were in charge, you're the chair of the board of supervisors here, what message would you want to send to the public, to everybody about what approach the county should be taking to these housing units? Because you're going to hear, and we have heard things like, it's a crisis. We can't lose another generation of people who can't live in this community, even though we've always had a housing crisis, and some people have been in office 20 years and we still have a housing crisis. What would you say if you were in charge? What would be your message to the public about how to do this the right way?
So, first, I think the whole, sort of thing that losing a generation and all of that, that it's a red herring at this point, because nobody's arguing against housing.
Yeah.
We're not arguing that whether housing should be added or not. The way is, how do we get there? What's the right way to get there? And if I were offering a message, I think I would say this is your legacy. More than anything else, as much as anything else that you do, as much as all the small things, this will be your legacy. And I was in the Peace Corps a long time ago, and I had a friend, Scott, and one of the things that we did in Peace Corps was we would go to the experimental station and bring back seeds and bring back things like that to the communities where we lived. And he lived in Marcos Espinel, was his community. Anyway, he brought back some sort of probably a hybrid of some sort of corn, and they were all runty. They were all these tiny little plants, and the people he sold it to, at least a bunch of them, had it planted all right along the road. And so whenever you'd go by, he would hang his head in shame as he would walk by. These are the seeds that he had procured or gotten for the community, and he'd have to walk by them all the time to see them, these awful looking plants. And that is the future if these things get developed. It is that we're going to drive by all of these places that were farms. We're going to, the traffic impacts. If you don't do a good job, a thoughtful job, you won't be able to defend yourself. You won't be able to explain it as easily. And, do something you really you're proud of as much as you can. I know we have the state is imposing things on us. I get that. But we still have to try and do something that we're going to say reflects who we are. And that's not what they've got right now.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. And I want to thank you for your time today, Councilmember Kasdin. You're my council member, my district. So
so do I have your vote? Or you want to build those ag properties? I hate them.
But it's always a pleasure to watch you at their meetings and to interview you and to have you in this format, because you're also a storyteller. I mean, you're making really good points here by using these examples. So I appreciate your time, and we'll have to do this again, and we'll talk about more Goleta focused issues down the road. So, but thanks a lot for your time and your smart commentary on this issue.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
You too.